Before we get started, make sure to subscribe to the channel and like this video. That way, you'll always stay connected to our stories and never miss the next adventure. Surviving a crash landing on an ice planet, Gia discovered as she blinked away the blood trickling into her left eye, hurt her feelings more than anything else. Sure, the physical pain was there, a dull throb radiating from her ribs and a sharp sting across her forehead. But the real insult? Her ship, the Wandering Dame, was now approximately 60% scrap metal and 40% expensive regret. She groaned, unbuckled herself from the pilot seat, and immediately regretted standing up too fast. The cabin tilted, or maybe that was just her sense of balance taking an extended vacation. Either way, Gia grabbed the edge of the console and waited for the world to stop doing gymnastics. "Okay," she muttered, wiping blood from her eyebrow with the back of her hand. Assessment time. Ship status, dead. Bones status, probably intact. Dignity status, non-existent. The emergency lighting flickered weakly, casting long shadows across the interior. Gia limped toward the cargo hold, stepping over a panel that had decided it no longer wanted to be attached to the ceiling. The impact had torn through the hull plating like tissue paper, and freezing air poured through the gaps, turning her breath into visible puffs of white. She found her emergency supply locker still sealed, which was either a miracle or the universe's way of apologizing for everything else. Inside, 3 nutrition bars that tasted like cardboard soaked in sadness, 1 medical kit that looked like it had seen better decades, a thermal blanket with suspicious holes in it, and a distress beacon that may or may not have been functional. The light on the beacon blinked amber, which in the universal language of technology meant, "I might work, but don't get your hopes up." "Fantastic," Gia said, shoving the supplies into a salvaged pack. "Just fantastic." The planet outside her broken ship was the kind of place travel brochures would describe as a winter wonderland, if those brochures were written by sadists. Ice stretched in every direction, interrupted only by jagged rock formations that looked like teeth trying to bite the sky. The wind howled with the kind of persistence that suggested it had personal beef with anything warm-blooded. Gia activated the beacon, set it on the console, and hoped that someone, somewhere, was bored enough to check uncharted sectors for distress signals. Then she wrapped the thermal blanket around her shoulders, grabbed her pack, and stepped out into the cold. The wind hit her like a physical slap. She squinted against the ice crystals pelting her face, and immediately started second-guessing her entire career path. Freight hauling, she had told herself 5 years ago, was safe. Boring, even. Haul cargo from point A to point B, get paid, repeat. Nobody mentioned the part where debris fields could shred your ship like confetti, or where you might end up freezing to death on a planet that probably didn't even have a name. She trudged forward, boots crunching on the ice, scanning for anything that resembled shelter. The ship was too damaged to provide any real protection, and staying put meant slowly turning into a very bitter popsicle. After what felt like hours, but was probably only 30 minutes, Gia spotted a dark opening in a nearby cliff face. A cave. Not exactly luxury accommodations, but it beat dying in the open. She approached cautiously, because caves on unknown planets were the kind of places where things with too many teeth liked to live. The entrance was wide enough for her to walk through without crouching, and the interior stretched back into darkness. Gia pulled a small flashlight from her pack and clicked it on. The beam cut through the shadows, revealing smooth stone walls that glittered with some kind of mineral deposit. The cave went deeper than she expected, branching off into smaller passages. It was warmer here, noticeably so, which meant either geothermal activity or something alive generating heat. That's when she heard it, a low rumbling sound, like distant thunder mixed with the growl of an engine that desperately needed maintenance. It came from somewhere deeper in the cave, echoing off the walls in a way that made it impossible to pinpoint the exact location. Gia froze. Every survival instinct she had screamed at her to turn around and take her chances with hypothermia. But curiosity, that wonderful human trait that had gotten her species into trouble since the dawn of time, made her take a step forward instead. "Hello?" she called out, immediately feeling ridiculous. Anything home?" The growling stopped. Silence filled the cave, thick and heavy. Then she heard it again, closer this time, followed by a wet, rasping sound that made her skin crawl. Breathing. Something was breathing, and it sounded hurt. Gia moved forward slowly, keeping the flashlight steady. The passage opened into a larger chamber, and that's when she saw it. The creature was curled in the far corner, and even injured and compressed into itself. It was clear this thing was built for violence. Dark blue-black fur covered its body, and running along its flanks were bioluminescent stripes that pulsed with a faint, sickly light. It had multiple eyes, 6 that she could count, arranged in 2 rows across a broad, angular head. Its muzzle was short and filled with teeth that looked like they could punch through hull plating. Retractable claws, currently extended, scraped against the stone floor as it shifted position. It was roughly the size of a large wolf, but the proportions were all wrong in a way that screamed, "Apex predator from a planet where everything wants to kill you." And it was bleeding. A deep gash ran along its left side, dark blood matting the fur and pooling on the stone beneath it. The bioluminescent stripes near the wound flickered erratically, like a failing light display. The creature's eyes, all 6 of them, locked onto Gia. Its lips pulled back, revealing even more teeth than she'd initially estimated, and it made a sound that redefined her understanding of the word hiss. It wasn't just a hiss, it was a vibration that traveled through the air and into her bones. A sound that activated every prey instinct humans had supposedly evolved past. Her legs wanted to run. Her hands wanted to drop everything and flee. Her brain wanted to apologize to her body for putting it in this situation. But Gia didn't move. She couldn't, really. Something about the way the creature looked at her, past the aggression and the threat display, registered as fear. It was hurt, cornered, and probably assumed she was there to finish whatever fight had left it in this condition. "Okay," Gia said quietly, keeping her voice steady despite the adrenaline turning her thoughts into static. "Okay, big guy. I'm not here to hurt you. I'm just, having the worst day of my life, and thought I'd share this lovely cave with you." The creature hissed again, quieter this time, but no less threatening. Its body remained tense, coiled like a spring ready to snap. Gia took a slow step backward. "Right. Personal space. I get it. I'll just be over here, not bothering you, definitely not thinking about how many ways you could kill me. Completely casual." She retreated to the entrance of the chamber, far enough that the creature visibly relaxed, and sat down with her back against the wall. The cold from the stone seeped through her clothes, but it was better than being outside. The creature watched her. All 6 eyes tracked her movements, glowing faintly in the dim light of her flashlight. It didn't attack, didn't move, just watched. Gia pulled out one of the nutrition bars and unwrapped it slowly. The crinkling sound absurdly loud in the quiet cave. She took a bite, grimaced at the taste, and chewed thoughtfully. "You know what's funny?" she said, more to herself than to the creature. "I spent 3 years training for deep space freight routes, learned how to navigate asteroid fields, handle zero-gravity cargo transfers, even took a class on interspecies trade negotiations. Nobody, and I mean nobody, taught a module on what to do when you crash on an ice planet and find a wounded nightmare creature in a cave. The creature's eyes narrowed, but it didn't hiss again. Small victories. Gia finished the nutrition bar, which did absolutely nothing to satisfy her hunger, and pulled the thermal blanket tighter around herself. The temperature was dropping as night approached, or what passed for night on this frozen rock. She could feel exhaustion creeping in, her body demanding rest despite the questionable sleeping arrangements. "I'm going to stay here," she announced, settling into a slightly more comfortable position. "Not because I want to invade your space, but because out there is a death sentence, and in here is only a probable death sentence. Math says I should stay." The creature shifted slightly, and Gia tensed, but it was only adjusting its position to keep pressure off the wounded side. The movement made it wince, a very small, very brief expression that looked almost familiar despite the alien features. Pain. Universal language, apparently. Gia stared at the creature for a long moment, her mind working through possibilities. The wound was bad. Infected, probably. Without treatment, the creature would either die from the injury or from whatever infection was already setting in. And if it died, she'd be alone on this planet with no company except her own increasingly bitter thoughts. "Tomorrow," she said quietly, more promise than plan. "Tomorrow, I'll see if I can help with that." The creature's eyes never left her, glowing softly in the darkness, watching, waiting, deciding whether this strange soft thing in its cave was a threat or just another casualty of a universe that didn't particularly care about either of them. Outside, the wind howled louder, and somewhere in the distance, ice cracked with sounds like breaking bones. Gia closed her eyes, kept one hand on the flashlight, and tried to convince herself that this was still better than being dead. The creature's breathing, ragged and uneven, became the rhythm she fell asleep to, a lullaby sung by something that could kill her without much effort, in a cave on a planet that wanted her dead, under circumstances that defied every reasonable expectation of survival. Just another day in the life of a freight hauler, she thought, and then thought nothing at all. Morning on the ice planet arrived with all the warmth and hospitality of a funeral in a freezer. Gia woke to find frost coating her thermal blanket, and her joints protesting every movement with the enthusiasm of a union on strike. She sat up slowly, wincing, and immediately checked the far corner of the cave. The creature was still there, still alive, still watching her with those unsettling 6 eyes that gleamed in the weak light filtering through the cave entrance. "Good morning to you, too," Gia muttered, her breath forming clouds in the frigid air. "Nice to see we both survived the night without murdering each other. Real bonding moment." The creature didn't respond, which was probably for the best. It shifted slightly, and Gia caught the way it favored its injured side, the bioluminescent stripes along its flank pulsing weakly. The wound looked worse in the daylight, or what passed for daylight on this miserable planet. The fur around the gash was matted with dried blood that had frozen into crystalline chunks, and the exposed flesh beneath had taken on a grayish tint that screamed infection. Gia stood, her muscles screaming in protest, and stretched carefully. Her ribs were definitely bruised, possibly cracked, but nothing felt broken enough to stop her from moving. She pulled out another nutrition bar, contemplated the existential sadness of eating cardboard for breakfast, and consumed it anyway. The creature watched every movement. Its eyes tracked the wrapper, the bar, the methodical chewing. When Gia finished, she held up the last bite. "Want some?" she asked, knowing full well the answer. "No? Yeah. I wouldn't eat this garbage either if I had a choice." She tucked the remaining nutrition bars back into her pack and approached the cave entrance. The wind had died down overnight, leaving behind a landscape of sculpted ice that glittered under a pale sun. Beautiful, in the way that things designed to kill you often were. Gia needed to check on her ship, see if the distress beacon was still functional, and maybe scavenge more supplies. She glanced back at the creature. "I'm going out," she announced. "Try not to die while I'm gone. I've grown attached to having company, even if that company looks like it was designed by a committee of nightmares." The creature's eyes narrowed, but it made no move to follow or attack. Gia took that as permission and headed out into the cold. The walk back to her ship took less time than she remembered, probably because she wasn't concussed and bleeding this time. The wandering dame looked even worse in full light, a twisted sculpture of metal and regret. She climbed through the torn hull and checked the distress beacon. Still blinking amber. Still maybe working. Still her only hope of getting off this frozen rock. Gia gathered what she could. A coil of synthetic rope, a small cutting tool, an emergency flare, and a container of water purification tablets. Not exactly a survival kit for the ages, but better than nothing. On her way back to the cave, she spotted movement near a cluster of ice formations. Small creatures, roughly the size of rabbits, but with 6 legs and translucent skin that revealed their internal organs. They scattered when she approached, disappearing into crevices in the ice. Food. Actual food. If she could catch them. Gia returned to the cave, empty-handed, but with a plan forming in her mind. The creature was in the same position, though its eyes tracked her entrance with slightly less hostility than before. Progress, maybe. "So," Gia said, settling back into her spot against the wall. "I saw some local wildlife. Little 6-legged things. Looked edible, or at least edible adjacent. Thought you might be interested, since you're doing that whole starving predator thing." The creature's ears, which Gia hadn't really noticed before, twitched slightly. Triangular. Mobile. Covered in the same dark fur as the rest of its body. "Right, so here's the deal," she continued, as if having a one-sided conversation with an alien predator was completely normal. "You're hurt. I'm stranded. Neither of us is having a great time. But if we're going to share this cave until rescue shows up, or until we both freeze to death, whichever comes first, we might as well not starve." She pulled out the cutting tool and examined it. Not exactly designed for hunting, but it was sharp enough to do damage if she could get close to one of those creatures. Over the next 3 days, Gia established a routine that would have horrified any survival expert. She ventured out each morning, tracking the small ice dwellers to their feeding grounds. Her first attempts at hunting were laughable. She slipped on ice, missed throws, scared away entire groups with her clumsy approach. But humans were persistent. Annoyingly, stubbornly persistent. On the 4th day, she managed to corner one of the creatures in a narrow crevice and dispatched it with the cutting tool. It wasn't pretty, and it definitely wasn't humane. But it was food. She brought the carcass back to the cave and left it near the entrance, far enough from the injured predator that it wouldn't feel threatened, close enough that it could reach it if it wanted. Then she retreated to her corner and waited. The creature watched the offering with obvious suspicion. Its nostrils flared, scenting the fresh kill. Minutes passed. Then, slowly, painfully, it dragged itself forward and claimed the carcass. The eating process was efficient and brutal, all teeth and tearing, and the kind of sounds that reminded Gia why apex predators were called apex predators. When it finished, the creature looked at her. Just looked, with an expression that might have been curiosity or might have been indigestion. Hard to tell with alien faces. "You're welcome," Gia said. "Don't say I never did anything for you." The pattern continued. Gia hunted, improving with each attempt, and the creature ate. It never thanked her, never showed obvious gratitude, but it stopped hissing when she entered the cave. Small victories. By the end of the first week, Gia had become a reasonably competent hunter of small ice creatures, which was not a skill she'd ever expected to develop, but here they were. The creature had regained some strength, though the wound still looked angry and infected. That's when the storm hit. It came without warning, as storms on hostile planets tended to do. One moment, the sky was its usual depressing gray. The next, it was a howling white nightmare of ice and wind that reduced visibility to nothing. Gia barely made it back to the cave, stumbling through the entrance with frost coating her eyebrows and ice crystals embedded in her clothes. She collapsed just inside, gasping, shaking from cold that had seeped into her bones. The creature was already deeper in the cave, away from the entrance where the wind howled like something alive and angry. It watched Gia shiver and struggle to wrap the thermal blanket around herself with hands that had stopped cooperating. Then it did something unexpected. It growled, low and rumbling, and shifted position. Not threatening. Inviting? No, that couldn't be right. But the creature had moved to a spot where the cave walls created a natural windbreak, where the temperature was noticeably warmer. It looked at Gia, then at the spot, then back at Gia. "Are you?" Gia said through chattering teeth. "Are you seriously telling me to move closer?" The creature growled again, impatient, this time. Gia didn't need to be told twice. She grabbed her pack and relocated to the warmer section of the cave, still maintaining distance, but definitely closer than they'd been before. The creature watched her settle in, then curled back into itself, keeping its injured side protected. They spent the next 18 hours like that, waiting out the storm. Gia dozed fitfully, waking periodically to check that she was still alive and still in a cave with an alien predator that hadn't decided to eat her yet. When the storm finally passed, leaving behind fresh drifts of ice, and a silence that felt oppressive after all that noise, Gia knew something had shifted. The creature wasn't just tolerating her presence anymore, it had actively helped her survive, which made what she needed to do next both easier and harder. "Okay," she said, pulling out the medical kit and examining its contents under the weak light. "We need to talk about that wound. And by talk, I mean I'm going to touch it, and you're going to not kill me. Sound good?" The creature's eyes fixed on the medical kit. All 6 of them, glowing with that eerie bioluminescence. It didn't growl, but it didn't exactly look thrilled either. Gia opened the kit slowly, narrating every action. "So I've got antiseptic, which is going to sting like a betrayal. Bandaging, which is probably not designed for alien anatomy, but we'll make it work. And these little adhesive strips that I'm like 80% sure won't poison you." She pulled out the antiseptic spray and held it up. "This is the part where you decide if you trust me or if you're going to remove my face. No pressure." The creature stared at the spray bottle, then at Gia, then back at the spray bottle. Its breathing had quickened, shallow and tense. Gia set the bottle down and held up her empty hands. "Look, no tricks. I'm just trying to help, because that wound is infected, and you're going to die if it gets worse. And honestly, I'd rather not be alone on this planet. Your terrible company, but you're still company." She picked up the antiseptic again and took a step forward. The creature tensed, muscles coiling, claws extending slightly. But it didn't retreat, didn't attack, just watched. Another step. The creature's lips pulled back, revealing those impressive teeth. A warning, clear and sharp. "Yeah, I know," Gia said softly. "Big scary human, doing big scary things. But we both know you're hurt, and we both know I'm the only thing standing between you and septic shock, so let's just, work together here." She knelt slowly, keeping her movements visible and deliberate. The creature's breathing had become audible now, harsh and rapid. Its eyes tracked every motion, every shift of weight. Gia reached out with one hand, palm up, letting the creature see it. "I'm going to touch the wound now. It's going to hurt. You're going to want to bite me. Please don't bite me." Her hand moved closer. The creature's entire body went rigid. And then, just as her fingers brushed the matted fur near the wound, it made that sound again. That bone-vibrating hiss that redefined threat displays. But Gia didn't pull back. She kept her hand there, steady, and spoke in the same calm tone she'd been using. I know it hurts, but I'm going to clean it, and then it'll feel better, probably." Medical science is a little fuzzy when dealing with species I just met. The hissing continued, but the creature didn't move, didn't strike. It held perfectly still, trembling with the effort of restraint, as Gia gently parted the fur around the wound. The infection was worse than she'd thought. The edges of the gash were swollen and discolored, leaking that strange bioluminescent blood that pooled in the fur. It smelled wrong, a sweet rot scent that made her stomach turn. "Okay," she said, her voice steady despite her racing heart. "Antiseptic time. This is going to be extremely unpleasant for both of us." She raised the spray bottle and applied a light mist to the wound. The creature's entire body jerked, a full-body flinch that made every muscle stand out in sharp relief. The hissing escalated into something closer to a snarl, teeth fully bared, eyes blazing with pain and rage. But it didn't attack. It held still, shaking, making sounds that were definitely threats, but it held still. Gia worked quickly, spraying more antiseptic, using clean cloth from the medical kit to wipe away infected tissue. The creature whimpered, actually whimpered, a sound so incongruous with its predatory appearance that Gia almost stopped. But stopping would mean doing this again later, and she didn't think either of them could handle that. "Almost done," she murmured. "Almost done. You're doing great. Way better than I would be if something your size was messing with my open wound." She applied the bandaging next, wrapping it around the creature's torso as gently as possible. The creature flinched with each pass of the bandage, but gradually, incrementally, began to relax. The trembling decreased. The snarling quieted. When Gia tied off the final knot and sat back, the creature was breathing hard, but no longer making threatening sounds. It looked at her with those 6 glowing eyes, and something in that gaze had changed. The raw hostility was gone, replaced by something else, something that might have been recognition. "There," Gia said, packing up the medical kit with hands that shook slightly from adrenaline. "All done, see? Not so bad. You didn't kill me, I didn't get eaten, and your wound is clean. Everyone wins." She moved back to her spot against the wall, putting distance between them again. The creature watched her go, then slowly, carefully, curled back into its resting position. The bandaging looked absurd against its dark fur, stark white against blue-black. But it was secure, and clean. Gia wrapped herself in the thermal blanket and closed her eyes, feeling the crash of exhaustion that always followed adrenaline. She'd done it. She'd actually done it. Against all logic and self-preservation instinct, she'd treated a wounded alien predator that could have killed her at any moment. When she opened her eyes again, hours later, the creature was still watching her. But this time, when their eyes met, the creature didn't look away. It held her gaze for a long moment, then settled its head on its paws and closed its eyes. Trust, tentative, fragile, but there. Gia smiled despite herself, despite everything, and whispered into the quiet cave, "Yeah, me too." 11 days after the crash, Gia woke to find the creature standing at the cave entrance, looking back at her expectantly. "What?" she asked, still groggy. "You need to pee or something?" The creature huffed, a sound that might have been exasperation, and took 2 deliberate steps outside before stopping again, waiting. "Oh, you want me to come with you?" Gia said, sitting up. "Since when did we become hiking buddies?" But she gathered her pack and followed anyway, because what else was she going to do? The creature moved slowly, still favoring its wounded side despite the bandaging, but with noticeably more strength than before. The infection was clearing. The bioluminescent stripes along its flank pulsed steadily now, no longer flickering with sickness. They walked together across the ice, Gia with her cutting tool, and the creature with its senses that picked up things she couldn't even imagine. When they reached the hunting grounds, the creature paused and sniffed the air. Then it looked at Gia and made a low chirping sound. "Are you?" Gia paused, processing. "Are you helping me hunt?" The creature moved to the left, positioning itself to drive prey toward where Gia crouched. And suddenly, hunting became significantly easier. The creature flushed out the ice dwellers, and Gia caught them with improving efficiency. They worked in sync, predator and human, turning survival into something almost resembling teamwork. "You know what?" Gia said as they headed back to the cave with their kills. "I'm going to call you Flint, because your eyes spark like flintstone in the dark, and also because I've been talking to you for almost 2 weeks without a name, and it's getting weird." Flint looked at her with what might have been approval or might have been hunger. Hard to tell. Over the next few days, their partnership solidified. Flint's wound continued healing, and Gia found herself actually enjoying the company. Sure, Flint was a terrifying predator from a species she knew nothing about, but Flint also had a tendency to huff when annoyed, and made this rumbling sound when content that was almost like purring. On day 16, Gia spotted something odd while they were hunting. Metal glinting in the distance, half buried in an ice shelf. Not her ship, different wreckage. "Stay here," she told Flint, who completely ignored her and followed anyway. The wreckage was older than hers, scattered across a wider area. Gia approached carefully, examining the debris. The hull plating had markings she recognized from bounty boards and trade warnings. Cometh design, scavengers, slavers, the kind of people who made legitimate criminals look respectable. She found the cargo hold, or what remained of it. Inside were cages, dozens of them, all empty now, but sized for creatures about Flint's dimensions. Some still had blood on the bars. "Oh no," Gia whispered, pieces clicking into place. "Oh, Flint." She turned to look at the creature, who was staring at the cages with an intensity that made the air feel heavy. Flint's entire body had gone rigid, hackles raised, a low growl building in their chest. This wasn't random wreckage. This was a capture operation. The Cometh had been here, hunting creatures like Flint. Babies, probably, easier to transport and sell. The debris field that destroyed her ship, the scattered wreckage, it all made horrible sense now. Flint's family was likely dead or captured, and Flint had only survived because the Cometh ship had taken damage, crashed, and left survivors to freeze. "I'm sorry," Gia said quietly. "I'm so sorry." Flint made a sound like breaking glass, high and keening, grief translated into vibration. Then the creature turned and walked away, not back toward the cave, but toward a different section of wreckage. Gia followed and found what Flint had scented: more cages, more blood, and in one corner, a functioning comm device, still powered by emergency batteries. Her hands shook as she activated it. The interface was in Cometh script, but the basic functions were universal. She bypassed the security with a trick she'd learned from a smuggler in a bar 3 years ago and accessed the distress beacon. New signal, stronger than her damaged beacon, broadcasting on frequencies that would actually reach shipping lanes. But as she configured the settings, another light flickered to life on the console. A locator beacon. Not one she'd activated. One that had been active the entire time, pulsing a steady signal into space, calling whoever owned this ship to come back. Gia stared at the readout, watching the triangulation data resolve. The Cometh ship, still in orbit, still operational. And now, thanks to her poking around in their wreckage, they knew exactly where to find their lost cargo. "Well," she said, looking at Flint, "we're about to have company, and they're going to want you back." Flint bared their teeth, all of them, and made that bone-vibrating hiss that Gia hadn't heard since their first meeting. But this time, it wasn't directed at her. Gia checked the comm device again, pulling up the transmission logs. 3 days, maybe 4, before the Cometh could send a landing party. She had her distress signal broadcasting now, but there was no guarantee anyone friendly would arrive first. She looked at Flint, at the healed wound beneath the bandaging, at the creature who had trusted her enough to let her help. Who had helped her survive? Who was, despite everything, the closest thing she'd had to a friend in years? "All right," Gia said, disconnecting the locator beacon and destroying it with the cutting tool. "New plan. We don't wait for rescue. We make sure when those slavers come back, they find a very unpleasant surprise." Flint tilted their head, 6 eyes gleaming with something that looked suspiciously like approval. "Because nobody," Gia continued, feeling something fierce and protective rise in her chest, "nobody takes my terrifying cave roommate without going through me first." The Cometh landed on the morning of the 19th day, their shuttle touching down with the kind of precision that spoke of experience and complete disregard for local wildlife. There were 6 of them, heavily armed, moving with the confidence of people who'd done this exact operation dozens of times before. What they didn't expect was the human waiting in the wreckage with a cargo net, a coil of rope, and absolutely nothing left to lose. Gia triggered the net trap as the first 2 Cometh entered the cargo hold, searching for their missing merchandise. The weighted edges caught them perfectly, tangling limbs and weapons in synthetic fiber. Their surprised shouts brought the others running, which was exactly what she'd hoped for. Flint hit them from the side. Despite the healing wound, despite being undersized and alone, Flint moved like liquid violence. Claws found weak points in armor. Teeth closed around a wrist holding a weapon, and the weapon clattered away across ice. The Cometh, who'd made the mistake of thinking a juvenile predator would be easy prey, learned exactly why the Vexen were feared across 3 sectors. Gia wasn't idle either. She'd spent 2 days preparing this ambush, using every piece of salvage she could find. A pressurized container became a makeshift flashbang. A fuel cell became an explosive deterrent. The cutting tool became something considerably more dangerous in close quarters. The fight was chaos. Brutal, desperate chaos where every second mattered and every mistake could be fatal. Gia took a glancing blow to her shoulder that sent pain screaming down her arm. One of the Quemeth landed a shot near Flint that made the creature yelp and stumble. But they held. Against trained slavers with superior weapons, a wounded human and a juvenile predator held their ground through sheer, stubborn refusal to quit. Then the sky split open with engine fire, and a ship descended that made the Quemeth shuttle look like a toy. Military vessel, human design, broadcasting identification codes that made the remaining Quemeth suddenly very interested in retreating. The shuttle lifted off in a scatter of ice and panic, leaving behind their captured colleagues and any pretense of completing their mission. Gia collapsed against the wreckage, breathing hard, bleeding from at least 3 places she could identify. And probably more she couldn't. Flint limped over and pressed against her side, making that rumbling sound that meant safety, meant pack, meant home. "We did it," Gia gasped, wrapping an arm around Flint's neck. "We actually did it. You terrifying disaster." The military vessel landed, and soldiers poured out with the kind of practiced efficiency that would have been intimidating if Gia had any energy left for intimidation. Their leader, a man whose uniform identified him as Lieutenant Umberto, approached with his weapon lowered but ready. "Gia," he called out, "we picked up your distress signal. Are you injured?" "Define injured," Gia replied, not moving from her position against Flint. "Also, before you point guns at my friend here, know that they just saved my life, and I'm really not in the mood for paperwork about why I prevented you from shooting them." Umberto stopped, taking in the scene with the kind of careful assessment that came from years of dealing with complicated situations. His eyes moved from Gia to Flint, to the captured Quemeth, to the scattered evidence of illegal wildlife trafficking. "That's a Vexen," he said carefully. "A juvenile Vexen." "That's Flint," Gia corrected. "And yes, before you suggest it, I know protocol says dangerous xenofauna should be contained for everyone's safety. Flint's not going to any containment facility." "Ma'am, I understand you've been through trauma, but let me be very clear," Gia interrupted, her voice gaining strength despite her exhaustion. "Flint is sapient. Flint made choices. Flint chose to help me survive, chose to trust me, chose to fight alongside me against people who wanted to cage and sell them. If you try to put Flint in a cage, you'll have to go through me, and I promise you that's going to involve way more paperwork than just letting us leave together." Umberto looked at her for a long moment, then at Flint, who had positioned themselves between Gia and the soldiers in a posture that was unmistakably protective, then back at the wreckage and the evidence of everything that had happened here. "The Quemeth will face charges," he said finally. "Illegal wildlife trafficking, attempted murder, about 15 other violations of interstellar law. Your testimony will be valuable." "Happy to provide it," Gia said, "from wherever Flint and I end up." "The regulations about Vexen are complicated. So are the regulations about heroism and interspecies cooperation, but here we are." Umberto's expression flickered with something that might have been amusement. "You're not going to make this easy, are you? I crashed on an ice planet, befriended a creature designed by evolution to be an apex predator, and fought off slavers with improvised weapons," Gia said. "Easy stopped being part of my vocabulary about 3 weeks ago." After a long pause, Umberto nodded. "Temporary custody, pending investigation and evaluation. The Vexen stays with you, but there will be monitoring and regular check-ins. I can live with that. And counseling. For both of you. Flint doesn't need counseling, Flint huffed, which Umberto interpreted correctly as disagreement with Gia's assessment. Fine, Gia conceded. Counseling for both of us. The journey to the rescue ship involved medical scans that revealed Gia's injuries were impressive, but not life-threatening, and Flint's wound had healed remarkably well, considering the circumstances. The captured Cometh were secured in the brig, and Gia gave her statement, while Flint dozed beside her chair. When they finally reached the cargo hold where temporary passengers were housed, Gia sank to the floor with a groan that came from her entire body. Flint curled up beside her, head resting near her leg, and made that contented, rumbling sound that vibrated through the deck plating. Umberto found them like that an hour later, Human and Vexian sleeping in an exhausted pile on the cargo hold floor. "What's your plan?" he asked quietly when Gia stirred. "Assuming the evaluation goes well, what happens next?" Gia looked down at Flint, at the creature who'd hissed and threatened, and then chose trust over fear, who'd hunted with her, protected her, fought beside her, who'd become pack in the way that transcended species, or logic, or any reasonable expectation. "Honestly," she said, "no idea. I'm a freight hauler. Was a freight hauler. Past tense since my ship is currently decorating an ice planet. But Flint's family is gone, and my ship is gone, and somehow we both ended up here, so I figure we'll work it out together." "That's not much of a plan. It's worked so far." Flint shifted, pressing closer to Gia's side, and made a small sound that might have been agreement or might have been a comment on the cargo hold's temperature control. Gia rested her hand on Flint's head, fingers tangling in the dark fur, and smiled despite the exhaustion pulling at her bones. "Besides," she added, "I never planned on adopting a nightmare creature that could kill me without much effort. But here we are, figuring it out one day at a time." Umberto shook his head, but he was smiling too. "I'll put in a good word with the evaluation board. Can't promise anything, but your testimony about their cognitive abilities and choices will carry weight." "Appreciate it." He turned to leave, then paused. "For what it's worth, you did good down there, both of you." When he was gone, Gia closed her eyes and let herself relax for the first time in weeks. The ship hummed around them, carrying them toward a space station and a future that was completely uncertain. But Flint was warm beside her, breathing steady and strong, and somehow that was enough. "You know," she murmured, half to Flint and half to herself, "I think we're going to be okay." Flint's rumble deepened, a sound like distant thunder mixed with satisfaction, and Gia took that as agreement. Outside the cargo hold, the stars stretched infinite and cold, but inside, two survivors who'd found each other against impossible odds slept peacefully, and tomorrow would worry about itself.